morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of Better Place, Talking International Law with me, Jonathan Coley, from RMIT University down here in Melbourne, Australia. Today, for our 10th and final episode of this first series of Better Place, I am absolutely tickled pink to have with me Michael Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House, one of the largest, most active advocacy and research organizations dedicated to advancing democracy and civil and political freedom in the world. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Jonathan. Great to see you down under.
And where are you tuning in from today?
I'm tuning in from the East Coast of the United States of America. I'm typically in Washington, D.C., but I'm taking a short vacation in Martha's Vineyard.
A well-deserved one, no doubt. Well, an idyllic place to have a little chat about human rights and international law and your journey in it. Thank
Absolutely.
you. I think there's no better way, I think, to wrap up this series of Better Place with you, Mike. On so many levels, it's apt for me personally, and we might get into some of those connections later on, but also especially in terms of the state of the world, the state of democracy, and of basic political freedoms. It seems to be in the news all day, every day with many countries. And again, I hope we can speak about that as well.
Absolutely. You know, we've been, for those of you who don't know about Freedom House, we've been tracking the state of democracy in the world really for close to 50 years. And I think during the period of our study of that issue, I think things have never seemed as bleak as they are now. I mean, certainly during the Cold War, I think you can make the case that many more people lived in unfreedom than today, but all the trajectories are going in the wrong direction.
Right. Well, on that note, let me segue to a more formal bio, Mike, before we get further depressed, get our audience further depressed. A more formal bio. Michael J. Abramowitz is president of Freedom House. Before joining Freedom House in February 2017, he was director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education. He led the museum's genocide prevention efforts and later oversaw its public education programs. He was previously national editor and then White House correspondent at a small little newspaper called the Washington Post. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former fellow at the German Marshall Fund and the Hoover Institution. Mike is a graduate of Harvard College. He's a board member of the National Security Archive. I'm sure I've missed something.
No, that's pretty much it. I think the main thing to know about me is that I was a journalist for most of my professional career up until about 11 or 12 years ago, and then I shifted into a new line of work. But you summarized things well.
And we really want to get back into that transition and what prompted it in a tick. But some obligatory follow-up questions. What isn't on your CV? Hobbies, COVID lockdown, new languages that you've learned, or are you taking up painting or something during this COVID period?
No, I've been actually, it's kind of funny. You're catching me at a time where I've outside of my house in a suburb of Washington, D.C., I basically spent our own version of a lockdown in Washington, D.C. for about 6 months, really not doing any travel, which is very unusual for me. About the only people that I saw regularly were my parents, who Jonathan, you know quite well, and seeing a number of friends from a socially distant. But we've had Freedom House, as you've indicated, is a fairly substantial enterprise. We have roughly 150 people working for Freedom House. We have offices in 10 or 11 countries, and so running that organization from my kitchen table
Yeah.
has been really required all of my attention. So I haven't really taken up a lot of hobbies. In fact, the one hobby I do, I'm a huge sports fan, and have typically will go to Washington Nationals games or football games, and that's all really been shut down as well.
Yeah.
So my one big kind of diversion has been shut to me. Although now we're starting to have in America sports on TV and outside, without crowds. But
Right.
I've been enjoying the NBA Finals, which just started last night here in America.
Right. Go Lakers. And your baseball team won last year, was it? Was it the Washington Nationals?
Actually, to be totally candid, I like the Nationals, and they won the World Series, which is our championship. But my true allegiances lie with the Baltimore Orioles, where my mother's from Baltimore, my wife's from Baltimore, and up until about 10 years ago, we didn't have our own baseball team in Washington. So I kind of was. I kind of became an Oriole fan by default. Okay,
but they're cellar dwellers, aren't they? The Baltimore Orioles these days, or
they're not very good. They've historically had when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, they were very good. They were one of the best teams in baseball, but they've fallen on very hard times in recent years. Although they had a little bit of an uptick about 4 or 5 years ago, but they're now in what they call in America the rebuilding phase.
Okay, the rebuild, right. And I'm collecting notes from everyone I interview. Your favorite ice cream flavor, please, Mike?
Mango.
Oh, that was quick.
That's actually not true. I like mango sorbet. My absolute favorite ice cream flavor is Cherry Garcia from Ben & Jerry's.
Okay, Cherry Garcia, play on Jerry Garcia. What is it? Is it just cherry flavor, or there's some sprinkles of something, I presume, in a Cherry Garcia?
It's hard to describe. It's kind of cherry flavored with chocolate. It's really good, and it's quite addictive. And if we bring in a pint of Jerry Garcia into the house, it's gone within a day. So I have to be careful about how much Cherry Garcia I bring into the house.
Great stuff. And let's kick things off a little bit in terms of career. And if I may ask you, what are you most proud of when you look back on your career? What accomplishment gives you the most, the greatest sense of pride and fulfillment?
Wow, you've asked like a stumper to begin with. I think that I would start by saying that there's no single accomplishment that I can point to, and there's no single accomplishment that I think I'm uniquely responsible for, in the sense of that I've always been part of larger institutions. So first the Washington Post, then the Holocaust Museum, and then Freedom House. And each of these organizations are really fine, important institutions in their own way that make major public contributions. And I'm proud of the work I did at all three of those institutions, but it's really part of a broader community. I think that one thing, just to sort of, I would say two things that I think I'm. At the Holocaust Museum, one of my jobs was really to help build up a committee on conscience, a Center for the Prevention of Genocide. So the Holocaust Museum is primarily a museum about the Holocaust in Europe between 1933 and 1945, and the museum is devoted to that. The exhibitions primarily focus on that event, but I think over the years, since its founding in 1993, the museum has been very forward-leaning in both looking at the past and looking about what it means for the present, and drawing lessons and inspiration from that past. And I think some of the early founders of the museum, including Elie Wiesel and a number of other significant people, thought that you honor the memory of the Holocaust not just by not only by remembrance and remembering the survivors, but also by trying to do what we can in the current day to prevent these crimes from happening again. And obviously, preventing these crimes, one can, number one, it's a global responsibility, and number two, it's a responsibility that sometimes hard to prove that you had an effect. I mean, you only remember the genocides that happened as opposed to the genocides that didn't happen because of one's efforts. So, but I'm very proud of my work to try to build up that program, which is now, I think, really one of the leading institutions in the world on, studying the prevention of genocide. And I would single that thing out as something, as among the things I'm very proud of. But, I'm proud of a lot of the work I did in journalism, and now, I think Freedom House is an incredibly important institution. And by the way, something that I think your Aussie audiences would be interested in is that, and I wrote about this in a piece for The Atlantic, is that Freedom House has been very active in calling attention to the repressive actions that China has taken with respect to Hong Kong. And we can talk more about that. But the bottom line is, after the United States government sanctioned individual Chinese officials for violations of human rights in Hong Kong, the Chinese retaliated by sanctioning a number of individuals, including me and my organization. And while I suppose I'm not happy about being sanctioned, I think it's a sign of the effectiveness of our work, and that that we were one of the organizations that they felt like they had to sanction. So that was a proud moment for me.
You've touched on everything I wanted to cover. Thanks very much, Mike. But hopefully we'll have some time to unpack all of that. I don't think I've ever spoken to a sanctioned individual before. So it's got to be kind of cool. You can wear that as a badge of honor, presumably.
Yes, although it's a little bit weird because it's not really clear what being sanctioned means in the Chinese government, but I certainly don't think I'm going to be traveling anytime soon to Hong Kong or China, which is a little bit sad for me because I was actually born in Hong Kong and I have a sort of a certain affection for that area, which I've not been back to for 35 years.
Is that right? I did not know that. So you were born in Hong Kong because of your folks?
Yeah, my dad, who you know, Jonathan, was a young U.S. diplomat who was a young U.S. diplomat. It was actually his second posting after joining the state in 1959. His first 4 years in Taiwan, and then he was a China language officer, and then he was a vice consul in Hong Kong between 1963 and 65, and that's where me and my sister were born.
So does that give you some rights in Hong Kong or China proper, like birthright citizenship or something like that?
Well, at the time, Hong Kong was a British colony.
Right.
So I've never seen where that gets. I'm just happy to be an American. I'm not sure I need either Chinese or British citizenship right now.
All right. Well, you might want to be jumping ship sometime soon, and a foreign passport might come in handy. You never know, Mike. Anyway, I'm being a bit facetious. Tell us a little bit about, let's start at the end. Tell us about your current role as president of Freedom House. What in your words, what's the mission of Freedom House?
Well, the mission of Freedom House is pretty simple. It's to champion global democracy. And our role is to push back against rising authoritarianism and to support democracies in strengthening their institutions and forms of government. So that's a kind of a broad mission, probably a little bit aspirational in many ways. But at Freedom House, we really focus on three specific functions. The first function, which we are probably best known for, is our documentation of the erosion. Well, let me just say, back up. I say the first job is the documentation of the state of democracy in the world. So every year in the first quarter of the year, for the last 50 years or so, we've released a report called Freedom in the World, which looks at the health of democracy, the state of freedom, really the state of political rights and civil liberties in 200 countries, some odd countries, a number of other territories as well. And this report gets a lot of attention. It's quoted in the media. It's used by government officials. It's used by human rights activists in their work. And I think this is one of the most important things that we do at Freedom House. And we also have other reports we do now as well, including a new report, well, newish report over the last 10 years called Freedom on the Net, which is actually going to be coming out in a few weeks. And for those of you who are interested in issues of net freedom, of internet censorship, of disinformation, that's a very, very strong report which people look at. So number one, we document the problem. We also have an advocacy voice. We work on, testifying before the U.S. Congress and other fora on issues of democracy and freedom. We've been an advocate, for instance, of the Global Magnitsky Act, which is an important tool for the U.S. government. Now, other governments, I forget whether Australia has its own Magnitsky Act, but anyway, we do advocacy. And then we also have an international programming division, and that really is a division that focuses on supporting human rights activists and defenders, including journalists, in doing their work. So for instance, just as one example, we provide a huge amount of, I don't know, huge might be relative, but we provide a substantial amount of direct assistance to human rights defenders who are working in authoritarian settings, to be able to continue to do their job, to be able to, if they need a lawyer, if they need physical security, that they can come to Freedom House for support. So those three things, we are research, advocacy, and action. So, and that's in some ways what makes us special, that we're not just, if you say, a think tank, just opining about this, but we're also trying to do things about this.
Right. And I want to get to each of those, but let me back up. And you've mentioned civil and political liberties, democracy, and freedom. You haven't mentioned international law yet. And as you know, this is a series about with practitioners of international law, doers of international law. Does that label sit comfortably with you? Is that how you would also describe your work?
Well, I would certainly say that our work is very much informed by international law. So I mentioned, for instance, the report we do, Freedom in the World. The indicators that we look at, draw inspiration from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And, we are always looking, when we evaluate a country, we are looking, among other things, at how a country, adheres to international legal standards. We're not a international law group per se. We're not like, the American Bar Association or the International Bar Association or groups like that. I mean, there are a number of other groups that focus specifically on international law, but I would say we're informed by international law. And in terms of some of our work, helping human rights defenders, document abuses, we're obviously guided by international law, because cases often that abuses violate international law.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, there's no question that you are and Freedom House are practitioners of international law. You don't, as you say. I mean, everything you've just said, I think, is spot on. In fact, Freedom House was co-founded by the mother of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was I think we call her our founding patron. That she was the early honorary co-chair of Freedom House, as well as, it's kind of interesting actually for your audience, as the other co-chair was Wendell Willkie, who is was a very interesting American politician who was a Republican but an internationalist. He ran against FDR for president in 1940. And he was the other honorary co-chair, and I often cite that just because our roots are very much in a nonpartisan. And we draw support from across the political aisle in America.
And the way we teach international law, modern human rights law, was stemmed out of the Holocaust, the atrocities of World War II. Eleanor Roosevelt, UDHR was 1948, was crafted. But Freedom House predates that. Freedom House was born during World War II, I believe, 1941.
Freedom House, right. Freedom House was founded in 1941. It's a kind of a cool story. It was founded really to mobilize public opinion against the America First movement of the time. So America First today has a certain connotation associated with President Trump, but in the late 30s and early 40s, it was a very strong movement, really an isolationist movement that was spearheaded by Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who crossed the Atlantic for the first time. And it drew a lot of support from all sectors of American society, in the business community, on college campuses. And really, the point of America First was that America needed to stay out of the European war that was developing. And that was a big fight between 1939 and 1941. Freedom House came into being really by allies of the Roosevelt administration to help mobilize American public opinion to fight that and to kind of get America into the war against fascism.
Right. Yeah, very interesting origins. And now, as you said, one of the largest democracy and freedom promotion organizations on the planet. For the record, in my opinion, freedom, especially in this context, is an agglomeration of civil and political rights. Without human rights, there is no freedom. They're synonyms.
The one interesting thing, Jonathan, that one could ask me about is that the Universal Declaration also included, obviously, economic and social rights.
Right.
And for a variety of historical reasons, that is not something that we have measured in the way that our report is really focused on political and
civil
rights.
And is that something that you
we do recognize? Excuse me.
Is that something that you are looking at in terms of adding to the portfolio?
I don't think so. I think our strength is really on these core rights. I mean, I think we have to recognize the context, and we certainly.
Right.
I certainly feel that those economic and social rights are very important as well, and we have to recognize that much of the world, maybe not the United States, but certainly a lot of the world does recognize those rights with the same level of intensity that political and civil rights, but just as sort of an artifact of our. I do think that those are very important, the political and civil rights, and we really, I think, do best by really zeroing in on what our strength is, and we leave it to others to measure the other rights.
And so, freedom of the world, I think is the title. A big bold title. So, what is the state of freedom and democracy in the world, Mike?
Well, I can give you sort of the story in a nutshell. For the first 35 years of that report, democracy was on the ascendancy. You had military dictatorships in Latin America fall. You had the end of the Cold War was a very important. You had the collapse of communism. You really had about 30 to 35 years of what Samuel Huntington, the political scientist, called the third wave, in which there was really a substantial growth in the number of democracies around the world. Starting about 15 years ago, that progress stalled, and we are now in a period of democratic decline. And that's real, it's substantial, it's validated by other people who studied the same issue, but I think Freedom House was early on to noting it. And I think the components of the decline include authoritarian countries like Russia and China in particular, which at one point had seemed to be possibly liberalizing, turning much more repressive. Then you had significant countries that had also been sort of potentially moving in a democratic direction. I'm thinking of countries like Turkey or Venezuela. They've turned the other way as well. And then I think the most disturbing kind of finding, in a way, of the last 5 years is that the established democracies in Western Europe and also the United States are also weakening. And I think a number from our last report really sticks out to me. About 40 of the strongest democracies of the world have suffered declines in political rights and civil liberties. About half of those 40 have suffered declines over the last 5 years. So you see a weakening of political rights and civil liberties, and my own country is obviously not immune from that trend. It actually started before the current president, but I would argue that it's probably gotten worse under the current situation.
And worse, to the point that I think we've just had the first presidential debate, but just before that, even I believe in the first time in Freedom House's history, you actually chastised a sitting United States president for eroding democracy in your own country.
Well, we've done that before. This wasn't the first time, but I would, and we've criticized practices of other presidents, but this president is kind of in a unique category, and I certainly think that we try to depersonalize it, but I think we really do try to point out where statements or actions fall short of the standards to which we apply. And I certainly think the one thing that we're deeply worried about right now, in particular, is his consistent and relentless efforts to delegitimize the integrity of our upcoming election. This is, by the way, a tactic that we're familiar with at Freedom House, that we've seen around the world. Many authoritarians try to basically, hold elections, but they're kind of the facade of elections. I mean, we still have real elections in our country, but I think President Trump is trying to really, rather than try to address potential problems, he's trying to undermine confidence in the idea that we can even have a fair election.
Indeed. And Freedom House, your organization, put out the Principles for Safeguarding US Democracy. As someone, as an outsider, but someone who has an abiding affection and admiration for the ideals of the United States, it's worrying that you need to have principles to safeguard US democracy in the first place. I mean, when you wrote those and decided to put them out, I mean, did you shudder? I mean,
well, I suppose we've kind of gotten a little bit used to the situation, which has been regrettable for the last 3 years. It is kind of a little bit depressing because I'm like you, Jonathan. I'm idealistic, and I believe that our country, while flawed and has some very serious issues that we probably have not come to grips with enough in our own country, that I do think that the ideals on which the country were founded still are universal ideals and are the right ideals. And, I don't see our country right fighting hard enough to uphold those ideals. But by the way, I will say, I think the fact that a group like Freedom House can criticize the United States, as an international as part of our international human rights work, I think that is a really important point, right? We have a very lively and very strong civil society in the United States. So Freedom House is part of, one of thousands of organizations that are, out there calling attention, to the problems, out there with protests, complaining about this or that. You cannot say, unlike in a lot of other countries where civil society has been, cowed or even legally, as you would know better than many, legally intimidated by having their, registrations questioned, rules restricting their ability to, that's not. I mean, some of that's happening in the United States a little bit, but really fundamentally, we have a very thriving and strong civil society, which is one of the things that gives me great hope about my country.
We hope so. I mean, yes, it does show, I think, demonstrate the fragility of democracy and of freedom, and that we do need to safeguard it. It needs to be front of mind, not something that we can take for granted.
Ronald Reagan, who was, a somewhat controversial figure in his time, but he really believed. By the way, it's kind of interesting because if you look at like some of the things that Reagan stood for back in the 80s, open borders, welcoming immigrants, promoting democracy, making democracy and human rights, part of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, these were things that would have put him, outside the mainstream of the current Republican Party. And but I'm always struck by a quote from Ronald Reagan, which I'm gonna mangle a little bit, but basically the point was, freedom is something that is not just simply passed on from generation to generation easily. It has to be fought for by each generation, whether it's fighting not necessarily war, but fighting in terms of something we have to struggle for. So I think it's a very inspiring idea.
And you're pushing back against those anti-democratic forces in the US, and you haven't also shied away from those anti-democratic forces in the other great power on the planet today, China. And you've mentioned already that you've been personally sanctioned. You're not allowed to go back to your birthplace in Hong Kong or presumably mainland China. I'm curious, are there glimmers of hope, though, for democracy and human rights in China?
I think there are glimmers of hope. I think, I'm not a China expert per se, but when you talk to people who know about China, people who are very well informed about it, I'm struck by the constant feeling that the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is really more brittle than one kind of assumes from kind of, definitely under President Xi. China has taken a decidedly illiberal turn. I mean, it wasn't like it was not a thriving, democracy by any means before he came to power. But, he's really, cracked down on dissent, strengthened the Great China Firewall, which, prevents ordinary Chinese citizens from accessing the internet. He's now, I think it's shocking to us, he's, imposed, he's really gone back on China's promise that they would respect, Hong Kong's system of government for at least 50 years with this new national security law. So there's definitely no question that China's gone back, taking a negative turn. However, I'm struck that 4 or 5 million or whatever million Hong Kong citizens hit the streets and protested last summer. I'm struck that you continue to get reports from inside China of individuals who are speaking out. I think we have to remind ourselves that these principles of freedom of thought, of freedom of speech, these are not American principles, they are universal. We started talking about the Universal Declaration. So I do have hope that because of the brittleness I hope that the system is more brittle than it appears. And I do think that, one thing that's interesting is, and she probably recognizes this, is that, because he's been on an anti-corruption binge, that, corruption is always the Achilles heel of these dictatorships. And certainly, corruption has in some ways helped contribute to a weakening of democracy, but it's also contributed to exposing authoritarian countries to push back from their own people. I mean, I think you look at a country today like Belarus, which really handled the coronavirus very poorly, widely seen as a country of, where insiders and favored people close to the president, are favored. And I think that is creating a very powerful pushback from ordinary Belarusians. So I think I do have hope. I don't think everything is all gloom and doom.
Let's circle back to the sort of the personal side. You mentioned that you grew up, that you were born in Hong Kong. You're a son of diplomat, so you must have gone to a few different high schools potentially. But I'm curious, during those early years, teenage years, what did you want to do when you grew up?
Well, I always wanted to be a journalist. That was what I wanted to do. I mean, I loved newspapers. I read newspapers from when I was a little boy, the sports pages, but then as I got older. So it's kind of funny. I worked on student newspapers both in high school and college, and when I graduated, I went right to working at a newspaper. There was no question that's what I wanted to do. And in fact, until I was about 45 or so, I'm now 56. Journalism was the only thing I wanted to do.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, I decided to leave journalism, but I still love it and still think it's an incredibly noble calling.
And so we'll get to the reasons why, but you were also the White House reporter at the Washington Post through, I believe, several presidential administrations.
No, I covered. I only covered the George W. Bush administration.
Excuse me. Okay.
I did different things at the Post. I covered politics. I covered local government. I was an editor for a while. I covered business. I covered healthcare. I actually did quite a bit of different types of reporting at the Washington Post.
I'm wondering, covering, I guess, the White House, were there any sort of high moments in terms of human rights and international law that now, in retrospect, sort of stands out in your mind?
Well, one thing that stands out in my mind is the issue of Sudan and Darfur. If you remember, for a variety of different political reasons, it's not widely known. President Bush had a great deal of interest in both political liberty and freedom in Sudan, particularly South Sudan. And then when the atrocities began in Darfur in 2003, 2004 timeframe, he was quite seized with that. And obviously there's a lot of focus on Iraq, Afghanistan. But when I was White House reporter, I really was interested in the fact that President Bush had this great interest in these countries. And so I actually wrote a number of stories about that and about how and why President Bush was so galvanized by this and looked at that. And it's interesting because one of the pushes at the time was for Sudan to break into two countries and create South Sudan. And I think I'd have to think about whether it was still the right thing to do, but South Sudan is not, from a human rights and economic, really from a human point of view, turned out very well right now. Although interesting, I never would have thought this 15 years ago, Sudan is one of the few countries in the world that is actually going on a different, more positive trajectory.
Right, including putting Omar al-Bashir up on trial. And so
I have to tell you, by the way, that's amazing from an international law. When I worked at the Holocaust Museum, it was the first month I was there, Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court, and that was obviously a big issue for the Holocaust Museum. President Bush actually, was not a fan of the International Criminal Court, but he cooperated with the court on the Bashir investigation and prosecution. I never thought that we would see the possibility of Bashir, being in the dock at The Hague, and that seems like it's potentially possible.
Possible, yeah. And so was Darfur the reason you jumped from journalism to the Holocaust Museum? I mean, from the outside looking in, that's a pretty hefty jump.
Yeah, it's crazy. I can't give you a single answer. I was, I would say a couple things. First of all, we've kind of touched a little bit about my parents, but I would say that, they're very remarkable people, as you know, because Jonathan, you worked for my dad when he was at a think tank in Washington, and they were both quite committed to human rights, humanitarian affairs, refugee rights, over their career. So I have to think that had some impact on me. I mean, this was something that I thought about, from the time I was in grade school. So number two, journalism has undergone a lot of changes over the last 15 to 20 years, some for the good, some for the worse. After about 25 years almost at the Washington Post, I began to just, think about doing something different. And it's kind of strange, but I met some people at the Holocaust Museum actually through my work on Darfur, and one thing led to another. And then I was at the Holocaust Museum in 2009, and it was a very great move for me. I've never regretted it. Although I love journalism, I also love the Holocaust Museum.
Yeah, fantastic. And you did such amazing work there, as you say, setting up the Committee of Conscience, I believe.
Well, it's called the Committee on Conscience.
On Conscience, excuse
and
me.
it
Yeah.
oversees the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the Holocaust Museum.
Which is it's a wonderful part of the museum, very forward-looking and giving voice to the never again cry from the Holocaust survivors that we hear very all the time. So really important work. And then what prompted the jump to Freedom House, which is a little bit more of a comfortable sideways move, I presume. But yeah.
Well, you can't always plan it. Freedom House, they had an opening for their president, with the person who runs the organization. I had been at the Holocaust Museum for 8 years. I was not really thinking about leaving, but I thought the opportunity to sort of run my own organization and put an imprint on the issues from like an executive level was very attractive to me. So I threw my hat in the ring, and fortunately, the board selected me.
Very nice. And Mike, what keeps you up at night vis-a-vis democracy, freedom, human rights?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What keeps you up at night?
Oh.
What really troubles you? Of all the things you've covered, and we've covered already some really depressing stuff.
Right.
Is there a particular thing?
I would say I'm going to give you a cheeky answer and then a more substantial answer.
Yeah.
What really keeps me up at night is thinking about how I'm going to fund my programs every year.
Right.
I do it, and I literally will wake up at 4 a.m. And worry about that. But I do think the issue of the United States being a model for democracy is what I'm most worried about right now. I don't think, and I don't say this as someone who thinks that my country is right or wrong all the time. We've made terrible mistakes in our history. We have the stain of slavery and of Jim Crow and of continuing racial inequality that continues to, really be a major impediment, major mark of shame for my country. On the other hand, because of the rights that were in our Constitution, we have the capacity to self-correct and improve. And so I think if you look at U.S. history, it is a continual history of fighting to improve things. And so I think that has global significance, right? I think people do look at the United States for inspiration in this. I mean, it's not surprising to me that the protesters in Hong Kong waved United States flags. Right. That was, or sang the Star Spanner. That is not for nothing that we did that.
Right.
So we know the United States is potentially a beacon for democracy and rights. Yeah. And I think that if we lose that, it's not only bad for the United States, I think it's bad for the global cause of democracy, because who is going to step in our place and make that? I just think realistically, what you see right now over the last 10 years is very opportunistic countries, particularly Russia, but really China, stepping into the breach and saying, no, the United States is screwed up. We are a model for how you should follow. And if that happens, if that kind of is not fought back seriously, that will really, that keeps me up at night.
I'm conscious of time. I'm going to beg your indulgence, even though you told me you had a hard deadline right now. Lightning round, okay, Mike?
Okay.
Heroes. It's no surprise. Your dad is a hero of mine, an old boss, a mentor, a friend that I hold in highest regard. Who's your heroes that have come before you?
I would say Eleanor Roosevelt is one. And also one that I think about a lot because of his connection to Freedom House is Bayard Rustin, who was one of the great civil rights leaders in America. He helped organize the March on Washington in 1963, and then he later actually became a trustee of Freedom House and led international missions for Freedom House. And so He was an amazing person. There would be two people that come to mind.
Best movie you've seen on democracy and freedom and human rights?
Wow. What's the best movie I've seen on democracy and human rights?
Like your favorite movie. It doesn't need to be the most serious one.
You're stumping me, Jonathan. Because I mean, I'll tell you. I'll tell you. By the way, this is not going to be. I'm not saying my favorite, but I've over the course of the pandemic, I binge watched the HBO show Westworld, and Westworld is. I don't know if you've watched it, but it is a very. It's really it's a dystopian tale about where we could end up if we continue with surveillance and artificial intelligence, and it's really about human freedom at its core. Okay. So I mean, it's somewhat of a flawed series, but it has caused me to redouble our in this regard.
All right, Westworld, I like that. Best book on democracy, freedom, and human rights you've ever read?
Well, one book that I read recently by Marianne Glendon from Harvard Law School about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now I'm blanking on the title of the book, but it's very, very good. It's about Eleanor Roosevelt and the creation of the Universal Declaration. I think it's a world unmade or world made. I'm sorry, Jonathan. You're gonna have to.
No. I'm also blanking.
But it's a very good book and very
I'll
accessible.
Put it in the description.
But I highly recommend it.
Your favorite international law moment in history?
The Nuremberg trial.
Cool. And there ought to be. Fill the gap. There ought to be an international law about
Well, I'm someone who believes you're going to consider this a dodge, but I do think that one of our problems now is that we're not doing a good enough job enforcing existing law. I feel that, I'm sure it's kind of interesting. I hosted a similar talk a few months ago with my friend Sushma Raman from the Harvard Carr Center and Bill Schultz, the former executive director of Amnesty International. They have a very interesting new book out about all the different new rights that need to be invented. And I certainly think they make a very powerful case, or they make a case. I may disagree with some of them, what they're saying, but they do make a case that rights evolve and that there'll be new rights that we need to recognize. But I do think that if you look at this whole situation in the world right now, particularly with the United States kind of right now being in a moment where the administration is not that supportive of these issues, that I think really rededicating ourselves to enforcing existing law, something that's very important.
I love that you said that, actually. So thank you for that. I think that's really important. I know you're out of time, but it's interesting in terms of creating new rights and your freedom of net report that we don't have time to talk about. But there is no right to the internet that exists in international human rights law. So I wonder if that is one right that you might actually support.
Yeah, let me just say this. I think our reports on this subject are very good, and I would really recommend to your groups. It's coming out in the middle of October. But I do think that the rise of social media, the rise of the internet really has created a very serious challenge for those interested in international law, because you're right that you want to maintain. I mean, I think that having access to the internet is a right. And, when governments shut down connectivity, whether it's in China or in Cambodia or India, where they've done that is a violation of rights, or it should be, in my view. But I also think that you have a situation where rights collide, right? So, the right to having free expression or saying what you want has led to very determined efforts to undermine democratic elections by the spread of disinformation and fake news. I mean, real fake news, not what our president talks about. So I think it's a balancing of rights that I think is going to really be a challenge for international lawyers in the coming years.
Fascinating. And my final question, advice to university students, and perhaps let me ask it this way. In retrospect, what advice would you have liked to have been told way back when you were in university?
Get fluent in another language besides your own. I think it seems kind of simple, but it's something I always tell young people who come talk to me, that, you know, we live in a world where just knowing English or just knowing Chinese or just knowing Spanish is not enough. And the people who are most effective on my staff, I think, tend to be people who speak, you know, at least 2 or 3 languages. And I think that's my biggest regret, that I didn't really get command of Chinese or Russian when I was in college.
Brilliant. Mike, we are well and truly out of time. If I may, Mike Abramowitz, thank you. Thank you for all the thankless and tireless work that you and your team do at Freedom House in advocating for greater freedoms for all the work that you've done in progressing how we collectively respond to genocide at the US Holocaust Museum, for all of that work. Thank you. Thank you for making the world a better place.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's really fun to be with you, and hope you all stay safe down under.